Geography of Genocide, and Introduction to Human Geography. The main region of her research is the South Caucasus, and she was funded by the National Science Foundation to conduct a study investigating resource-related conflict in Azerbaijan. She's a board member on the Armenian Partnership Project with the Kansas National Guard and regularly gives briefings at the Air Force Special Operations Command Center at Hobart Field, Florida. She recently completed a book titled Environmental Politics, Scale and Power, which is forthcoming with the University of Cambridge Press.
Actually, it's now out.
Oh, it's now out. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Is there a mobile mic?
There's not a mobile mic.
Okay, that's fine.
That's a
Well, actually, yeah,
That's
we do have one on the panel too.
Okay, I'm not good with podiums. I feel kind of caged in.
Do you mind holding this? Okay.
So I'll have to do. I'm Bob Barker. I'd like to thank all the organizers for this. I know this took a lot of work. Bart, Edith, everybody at Crease, the people filming, all that. Thank you so much. And I'd like to welcome all the guests here to Kansas. There's more than basketball. There's wheat fields here in real America. This is it, baby. Okay. Anyway, so here we are in Kansas, and this presentation, that's actually a great setup, although chronologically perhaps Dr. Kakachi and I should have just been reversed, because I'm going to give some of the backstory to some of the stuff he was showing. I didn't have a slide of the Rocky Tunnel. Thank you. That's perfect. And what I want to do is I want to look at, as a political geographer, I'm interested in border theory and how geographers look at the issue of borders. So I want you to be, I'm sort of cut through all my literature review. I'm like, okay, bring it down to 2 slides, the whole literature review. So one is that I want you to be thinking about borders as a spatial way of communicating power, different forms of power, not just political power, but economic power, military power, cultural power, all these kinds of things. So borders as a way of communicating power. And we can also think of bordering as a process, and it's a process that is never really finished, as we've just heard. I mean, this is an ongoing process of the border. And the borders are sometimes permeable, sometimes closed, and so borders have a lot of different aspects to them. That's what I want to look at. So power at the border, we can think of having the visible forms, the things that we're used to seeing. It looks like a border, you know, a tunnel with gates, checkpoints, watchtowers, those kinds of things. But there are less visible forms of power. Gabriel Popescu has just finished a book on borders. And I want us to be thinking about why, how, and by whom are borders erected. Whose interests are served and whose interests are hurt by the existence of borders. So when we talk about border security, when I hear the phrase border security, I immediately think, whose security? What are we securing? And who is somehow missing out in that securitizing process? So the South Caucasus, as we've heard, and as you probably know, is a very complex area. It's often generalized, and working in the South Caucasus, I love how they kind of put things together. Well, there's Islam and there's oil, so there's going to be conflict. You know, it doesn't make any sense. But people don't tend to understand the South Caucasus. So what I want to do in this presentation is look at borders as a way of examining the power relations of current events. Okay, so the 3 cases I'm going to look at in 18 minutes. I'm going to give you a little bit more information on the Georgian-Russian conflict. We should sit next together at lunch. There's lots to talk about. I also want to look at the Armenian-Turkish relations over their closed border, and then I'll look at Nagorno-Karabakh and the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So these 3 cases are really just my way of getting into looking at border issues. All right, so here, you know, as a geographer, you have a map. So closed border over here, right there, and then here's, as we've already seen, our Russian-Georgian borders, and those borders have actually changed how we're defining those borders. Some people are defining borders, and Nagorno-Karabakh. And of course, it's very touchy. Do you show a map that show the occupied areas? And if you do, then whose map do you show the occupied areas? So I just went with the CIA map, which is probably just as contentious. Okay, so the first case I want to look at is borders and power. And borders is as a direct reflection communicating power. This is the Russian-Georgian conflict. Okay, so zooming right through the whole conflict, which of course you could spend a whole day just talking about that. So Georgia went on the first day of the Beijing Olympics. They wanted to secure this breakaway region of South Ossetia, and they had really underestimated Russia's military strength and willingness to protect this area. And so a lot of people thought that maybe this is Russia's kind of overwhelming response, like Georgia slapped it and Russia came down with, you know, the mother Russia, the iron fist, and really thought maybe this is a reaction more to the West's recognition of Kosovo, which was a slap in the face to Russia and its ally Serbia. And so we wonder, can we look at South Ossetia and Abkhazia really not in something important so much in and of themselves, but as a pretext for an armed demonstration of Russia's power? That's what I'm getting at here with this case. So, you know, you've got here's the war and the whole everything that was happening. And what I want to get to here is that the Russians really could have quite easily gone in and taken Tbilisi. And one of the things that set the West, which pretty much sat on our hands, we didn't really do that much, we sort of just watched aghast as Russia stomped into Georgia. They got very close to the oil pipeline, which was a big concern for us. So we could see, ooh, they could threaten this very important, you know, bloodline going through the region. So Russia really did sort of flex its muscle and say, hey, if we wanted to, we could mess with the oil exports. Now, we've already heard about some of Russia's preparations for war. Let me give you a couple more. They had also armed South Ossetia. They had imposed a visa regime on Georgian citizens, so Georgians had to have a visa. They had ended all postal and telecommunication direct transportation links, usually red flag. They'd also granted citizenship to the South Ossetians. That way they could say that they were going in to protect the Russian citizens. Also, and they had been doing this for a couple years prior, actually all of these preparations go back almost 10 years. So they'd really been putting some things in motion, as this wasn't something that just happened. So they banned vital Georgian exports, and they banned them, you know, how do you justify banning Georgian wine and Georgian water? Well, they said they weren't up to, you know, sanitary standards of Russia or something like that. This sort of gave another pretext of why they were doing this. They had placed Russian journalists in Tsingtali, right where a lot of the action was going to take place. And the reason they did this is that then they could control what the whole world, how the world saw this conflict from the journalists, you know, live at the place where all the conflict is happening. And without any other voice to communicate a different perspective, Russia got to really influence how the world saw this conflict. They also, those nice guys, had volunteered to go in and upgrade some Abkhazian railroad links out of the goodness of their humanitarian hearts. And those railway links actually turned out to be vital for the transport of military equipment to support the Russian effort in Georgia. So we see all these plans that were in place well ahead of time, well before the conflict, and it's almost then they were just baiting Georgia to you know, do something. You know, hit me right here, I dare you. Okay, so some people think this was really Russia trying to go back to some sort of, you know, rebuilding its empire and holding on to its empire, its local region. Or was it trying to establish its hegemonic power in the region? It definitely showed. It certainly got enough might that it can flex its muscle there. But what we see is that the borders in this region, specifically the Georgia-South Ossetia border and the Georgia-Abkhazia border, those were the borders of interest. Those particular borders, those particular places and territories weren't of direct interest to Russia per se. What they were really doing was serving as a proving grounds for Russia to communicate its frustration to the West, to NATO, and even to Georgia for developing close ties with the West. And so this is really one way that we can look at the rationale for Russia's very strong response to Georgia's moves. Now, the borders themselves did not change, as we've seen on the maps. They stayed going back to the Soviet Oblast borders, but Russia may have stepped a little too far in recognizing these now as independent political entities, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And does anybody know who joined in recognizing South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent? Nicaragua and Hamas. Okay, so that tells us something. All right, so that's one case. That's one way to look at borders as power and how those borders really weren't important in and of themselves, but more as communicating power. Now, we can look at the case of Armenia and Turkey. And here, the point that I want to get to is that this is a good case where borders are no longer at the border. Borders are no longer at the border. So, the closed border here was actually closed in 1993 by Turkey in support of their Turkish brothers in Azerbaijan during this conflict with Nagorno-Karabakh. And of course, these tensions between Turkey and Armenia go back to the Armenian genocide in 1915 and 1923. It's a very contentious issue, whether we even call it a genocide or how we refer to it. And you also have to keep in mind that Mount Ararat is a symbol of Armenian nationalism. This is Mount Ararat, which is in Turkey. And it's important to Armenia because the story is that this is where Noah's Ark landed. And Armenia being a Christian country, they adopt this as this is a key element to their homeland. But as I said, it's over in Turkey across the border. So the fact that they're using this landscape as a national symbol, it's kind of like Canada putting the Grand Canyon on their currency and their stamps. We might question that. In fact, there was, back in 2008, Turkish President Gül had accepted an invitation to go to Yerevan to watch a World Cup qualifying match. And things looked like relations were warming. It's sort of a case of football diplomacy. We had a Turkish diplomat actually going to a country to watch soccer where there are no formal diplomatic relations. And I would just point out that at the time that they played, here's the soccer team emblem, Mount Ararat. They've changed it. It's now like a tiger or something much more fierce than a mountain. Anyway, so there's hopes that things between Turkey and Armenia were warming up. And the warming trends continued actually back in 2009 when the Turkish and Armenian president signed protocols to try to open up the border, normalize relations. But then Azerbaijan got involved and they said, if you guys open the border before Karabakh is resolved, I'll talk about that in a minute, then we're going to miss our chance of resolving our territorial conflict. And so when Prime Minister Erdogan said that we had to first figure out the Karabakh conflict, Armenia dropped the protocols and they said, okay, we're not playing this game anymore. So it got very complicated very quickly because it was bringing in other regional conflicts. Now, when Obama campaigned, he actually said that he was going to recognize the genocide. And this was huge because no U.S. president has ever recognized the Armenian genocide as such. They've never used the G word. It might be mass human atrocity. It could be acts of genocide, which is one that has been used. And a journalist once asked, who was it that said that? Madeleine Albright had called things acts of genocide. And somebody once asked her, how many acts of genocide does it take to have a genocide?
So-called genocide.
What?
So-called genocide.
So-called. That's right. So-called genocide. Anyway, and we could get, I could launch right into genocide lecture mode here, but I'm not going to. He hasn't recognized the genocide because to do so would really irritate Turkey, which is a key NATO ally. So what we're starting to see is that this border between Turkey and Armenia has a lot of implications at multiple scales, not just regional implications, but really international implications. In fact, other countries and several U.S. states, Kansas is one, Kansas as a state has recognized the genocide. And that goes all the way back to Bob Dole, and the reason that the Kansas National Guard has ties with Armenia really goes back to Bob Dole, who was operated on by an Armenian doctor. He was injured in the military, and he heard from this doctor about the genocide. He's become one of the strongest political advocates of recognizing the genocide in this country. So, and so is George Clooney. So, quirky bed partners, I don't know. But you also have places like France. The French Parliament has acknowledged the genocide because there's a very active Armenian lobby in France, and so they wanted to be sure. You also can't deny the Holocaust in France. So they've got some different laws on the books, and recognizing the Armenian genocide is one of those. So you've got this really interesting network of the Armenian diaspora getting political recognition in certain places, which again brings that border, that Turkish-Armenian border, to really a very international, multiple dimensional scale. So the closed border, if we're actually at the border, it does obstruct legitimate business, travel, and traffic, and so forth. However, local entrepreneurs, shall we call them, benefit by controlling these monopolies and these cartels. And so to open the border would actually threaten their livelihoods. So there are a lot of people who have a vested interest in keeping that border closed. So we have to keep that in mind. Everybody, we tend to think, oh, open borders, that's the best thing, but not for everybody. So again, we have multiple spatial channels at that border and beyond that border. Okay, so finally, let me take a look at Nagorno-Karabakh, borders and identity, and the role of borders in shaping national identities, and the fact that national identity often has a territorial dimension. Okay, again, so here's my contentious, non-contentious CIA map. And I just want to point out that we have Nakhchivan is an exclave of Azerbaijan. And again, in the Soviet times, when the borders were drawn, the same thing as we heard with the Fergana Valley from Dr. Kangas. These recognized sort of oblasts and autonomous oblasts of different levels that had to do with the identities of the people here. So this had always been predominantly Armenian, even within Azerbaijan. And that was fine until the Soviet Union started to fall apart and unravel. And even in 1988, before it fell apart, a referendum was held by the population here to vote on whether or not they should no longer be under the rule of the Azeri leaders. So this even goes back to, the status of this region is very contentious, and it has quite a complicated history to it. So for Azerbaijan, what is the meaning of Karabakh? Well, it has a lot to do with state sovereignty and legitimacy, and they often point to the UN rules that you can't take territory without having international recognition. Thank you. It also has to do with territorial integrity and portraying itself as, hey, we are a legitimate state, we are an official state, and you can't just take a chunk of our territory. So it has a lot to do with kind of taking the role of statehood and territoriality. This is a real public priority. In my work that I did in Azerbaijan, and I included a survey of 1,200 people, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict was by far and away the most important public issue of anything, running water, electricity, everything. It was in Nagorno-Karabakh was by far and away. So when the government controls the media, they can keep these things alive. They keep it alive on the landscape. This is Martyrs Lane, a huge cemetery. Everybody goes to visit there, and so forth. And also, a lot of people have lost loved ones in the conflict, so that also keeps the conflict alive. We could ask why Baku hasn't been more effective at dealing with the conflict. They are ramping up their military investments once again, but really, we end up getting kind of lost in the political posturing in Baku, as you have all these kind of oil oligarchs, like this. This is a postage stamp. Here's, important national symbols with the former president and Putin, and oil is our national wealth. You get so caught up in these politics in Baku that, politically speaking, Nagorno-Karabakh loses some of its salience in the political world. However, you also have a lot of internally displaced people living in railway cars and so forth, and this actually almost keep us alive on the landscape because it behooves them to do so in the international arena. Look, we've got suffering people because of those Armenians that are occupying our territory, and they tend to keep this sort of alive. Now, for Armenians, and this isn't actually in Armenia, this is actually in Moscow. It was a great hotchkiss, so I had to take a picture of it. Both within and without Armenia, as I said, the Armenian diaspora is very active, and one of the things that they share is this history of being targeted for eradication. So for them, losing territory is like being threatened with losing their identity, losing their nationality. So what we see is that Karabakh is symbolic of a territorial homeland. We might not be able to get Mount Ararat, but surely we can keep Karabakh, which we're already occupying. Also, part of the problem with Karabakh, who wants to put an oil pipeline or upgraded railway links through Armenia? Nobody. So Armenia is constantly losing out on these transportation and export routes that go right over its territory. So it's also important economically. So, quick concluding points is what I tried to show with these three case studies is that borders can reflect competing forms of power, which is not just one unilateral form of power. Borders are relevant at multiple scales simultaneously, and sometimes we miss that if we look just at the border at one particular level. And borders can have different meanings for different groups and identities. So that's my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
In the first question, then I'll open up the floor for questions. As I'm listening to your presentations and as I'm reflecting on the theme of the conference, I think about the issue of security, and I do not work in the South Caucasus area, which was probably evident in my reading of the biographies, because I couldn't pronounce most of the words. But I do work on issues related to the Department of Homeland Security in the United States. And what I found in my work is that there's often a tension between the promotion of national security and the realization of local level security. So for example, the Department of Homeland Security, its primary mission is national security, so they secure the border, and they also engage in interior enforcement in the name of national security. And that creates a lot of insecurity in communities. So in the United States, communities that where police officers collaborate with immigration officers in the name of national security experience local level insecurity. And at the border, there's plenty of human rights violations that could be defined as lack of security. So what I was wondering if each of you could reflect briefly on how you define security in your work.
Security in my work. It's an interesting thing in itself because Fanta's in the discussions a lot in the news right now. And Afghanistan and Pakistan in themselves are having a hard time, I think, defining security there because the Duran line is not is contested in between them too. So what is the border there, even though the Duran line has been established? And with you having so much incursion or movement of population back and forth between the Pashtun population doesn't accept the border in itself. So that in itself is a challenge when they're trying to, if they were to repeal the FCR, you're going to have to define that border better and then also be able to secure it, so Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so it becomes a layered conundrum. And I don't know if I can actually give you a very good answer of how I would define good security along that border when there are so many caveats and so many variables that are present within that very, very strange area there. So I apologize. Yeah, I don't know if I would be able to give you that specific question.
I'm sorry to be probably like less optimistic, but I think that to talk about security in South Caucasus is much more difficult than if it's better to talk about insecurity, because that's what we have there actually. And this is actually emphasized, especially I didn't go into the details of the relation between Georgia and Russia, but we have a 40-kilometer Russian tanks from Tbilisi. So within this situation, actually, Georgia, the country, has a security dilemma, and that's the major kind of major foreign policy drive. So until this is not solved, I don't see that there is a kind of some kind of regional stability there. And it's not only Georgia, but there's the same kind of problem in Armenia, same kind of problem in Azerbaijan. So this is a kind of, I would say, like failed state, failed region. It's unlike, for instance, Baltic states, which has kind of common identity or something. This is a failed state. Three of the countries, they have their own foreign policy priorities, which are absolutely different most of the time. Georgia goes, at least tries to identify itself towards West. Armenia, because of this historical atrocities with Turkey, tries to be a kind of pro-Russian, and Azerbaijan is somewhere between. So all these kind of things really creates tension there. And also, this is exacerbated by involvement of at least these three countries, and the small entities like South Abkhazia, even they can manage also, they try to involve the international actors, so for instance, the United States, European Union, Russia, and something, and this makes these things even complicated. So basically we have the insecurity more than, that would be probably the correct term than, for instance, the security.
Yeah, that's a big question, security. And I think we want to have a rubric or an algorithm or at very least a checklist where we can say, okay, this is what you need for security, and we can apply this to lots of different cases. But I think that Dr. Kakaji is absolutely right, and the same reasons you point out. I mean, it's very contextual what security is. And I think even if we think of security as stability, well, you can have stability and still have people who are, either hungry or feel threatened or don't feel safe, or there's lots of elements there. And even predictability. Well, we can predict even when things are insecure, right? So I don't know. I don't have an answer, but I think this is why it's important to do these kind of in-depth regional studies to understand that security really plays out differently in different places. And so I don't have a strict answer for you except to point to students who are here to say, okay, guys, there's a lot of work to be done.
this is also, it's also related with the perception, actually, when we speak about security. For instance, I know the several cases when there was a kind of survey conducted different parts of the parts in Europe, and for instance by police, and they just ask the citizens, okay, which part of the city is the kind of where you feel kind of less secure, and they identified, for instance, a railway station, and then they just went, to identify what's wrong there, and when they went for and they could not prove it because there was less crime there, and the main probably reason was that there was no light there was kind of dark place. So, and this is somehow related to the perception and misperception also. So that's also to take into account.
Well, thank you very much. I think that was really interesting responses to the question. And now I would like to open up the floor. Yes? Sorry, we can't hear you, so I'm going to...
Okay, thank you.
I have a question to the first presenter. You mentioned the returning mullahs to the normal status. And I found this idea very interesting since I faced almost the same theoretical problem during conducting my research, though the situation was different and there were no mullahs, there were Buddhist priests. And as far as I know, the mullahs in Afghanistan, now they connect the insurgents with the transnational network of their Islamic supporters and sponsors. So it looks like this is the main ground of their political influence. So what do you think would be a right solution of the problem? How to return them to the normal status, which was obviously lower before the insurgency broke?
I can talk loud, it doesn't matter to me.
I need some exercise.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. And the beautiful thing about that one is, it'll be my dive or my duck here, is that I'm trying to point out on this one with my flow chart there, that if immediate repeal is a problem because of this, I don't think I probably have every one of the answers, but these are some of the things that should be considered if one was to take this federal law that is, as described, treats the people differently than the rest of Pakistan. But how do you deal with the problem? It doesn't just go away overnight. And so, you're going. When I initially talked about this, is you establish or you find somebody that you can talk to. So with the tribal elders that have been killed, who is going to take up their place? And if they do attempt to take up their place again, what keeps them from being killed like the other hundreds of Maliks or tribal elders before? So it's a circular conundrum that I, thank goodness, don't have to provide the answer for, but I'm just trying to bring up to the forefront of everybody's thought that this problem exists, and it's a big one.
Diplomats are able to create deliberate ambiguity when it comes to history in order to enhance or keep security. In fact, I think that's almost a professional job of diplomats to create this deliberate ambiguity. Now, with respect to borders or border areas, again, deliberate ambiguity often would be very important for security, but how? Do you have any way of analyzing how can that be created? Is it being created with respect to countries in the South Caucasus or anywhere else, you see? But I think to try to, not to sharpen differences, but precisely to create this ambiguity is essential for security, how it is to be created.
Leslie, who are you directing your question to?
About relating to this border.
For whom? For
To
whom?
whom is it directed?
Oh, for everybody.
I think regarding your question, if I knew the answer. Probably we could win the Nobel Prize together, you and me. But because, as I said, this is in case of South Caucasus, this is a failed region. I mean, it doesn't have an identity in that sense like it. So you need really to overcome a lot of problems, starting from first border, some other security problems, and then you can also, and there's some problem related with Europeanization or whatever you call it, some other stuff. So unless you don't have that, and you don't have the, identity, like regional identity, I think this will be very difficult to work there, because, and there's some kind of attempts, maybe lately, from at least Georgian elites. They have some kind of understanding that there is a need to have some kind of, some kind of more broad understanding of this security, and they come with different perspectives, starting from about the common South Caucasian whatever. But the thing is, it's not really kind of. It's very contentious because it's related with politics. So basically, that concept which Turkey or Georgia has exclude Russia, and that I think that doesn't work. So there should be some kind of common understanding from all sides involved there, and especially that's true with the case of North Caucasus, because some people consider Caucasus as, and Russia actually considers Caucasus as a one region. And that's why for Russia it's important to have some kind of military influence in South Caucasus, because they consider it as a kind of barrier for NATO or Western so-called bad influence or whatever. So until we don't really solve this kind of problem, I think it will be very difficult probably to talk about this issue.
You are going to get your exercise.
Well, yeah, that's
I
good.
can probably project. Thank you.
As I'm hearing this conversation, I'm wondering whether one of the layers that you really all have to think about when you're talking about borders and security is the modern doctrine of state sovereignty. It's not the only factor, but it seems to be a big one. If you call the Caucasus a failed region, failed with respect to what? It seems to me failed with respect to of states to be able to assert their sovereignty. If you think about the tribes in that region, they don't care about the borders. States care about those borders, and that's what makes it an issue. And I like your multiple, Shannon, your sort of multiple levels, but I think one of the main levels that really imposes all kinds of structure and all kinds of restrictions on other levels of border is the notion of state sovereignty, and everything is wrapped up in that particular doctrine at all sorts of different levels. And that also helps to make sense, I think, of some of the security issues, because a state has to be existentially as well as materially secure, and not having proper borders is an existential as well as a material issue. You want to be able to define yourself territorially in terms of sovereignty. I think that's really key. I'm thinking even in terms of an experience I had where a house behind my house was demolished, and they're putting up a new house. So the surveyors came in, planted their flags, and I looked and I thought, this is great. My fences are all built on my property line. My neighbor beside me and the neighbor across the back from me have put their fences up to a foot or two within where the survey pins indicate the neighbor's property actually. So I'm laughing because I don't have a problem. I have my domain. I can do whatever I want. Both of my neighbors have to worry now because they've built fences in places they don't legally belong. It seems to me that's almost sort of a small microcosmic example of what it means to have sovereignty. Right? I have complete control over my domain within the laws. My two neighbors now don't, so they have certain insecurity issues.
I have a comment. Thank you, Tom. That's a good comment. And we do tend to get caught up in this ideal Treaty of Westphalia, state idea. However, states are not cookie cutters, right? And so every state has to make sure they have established their internal sovereignty and their external sovereignty. So, congrats, you've got external sovereignty. Your fences you're awesome. Internal sovereignty, we don't know what goes on in the Hilke household, right? How do you control your power?
There's not much insight.
We don't need the details. But I think this goes back to the question of security. You can secure your state borders. I mean, look what's going on in Libya, right? Secure state borders. It's got seat at the UN. You got your flag. You got your postage stamps. Your national anthem. You got all this stuff that goes with state sovereignty. But what's going on inside that state? he's dealing with the same kinds of things. You've got these, pockets or areas or tracts of concern. No, a state is supposed to be homogenous. That's what we learned from the Treaty of Westphalia, and they're not, and that's part of the issue. But that's a great comment.
Pakistan kept the FCR for a reason. That area has been a problem for a long, long time, and Pakistan has the interesting problem of historically, since their the makeup of 1947, the West hasn't been their overarching concern, other than supporting the Taliban and helping keep a buffer that way, the buffer system. Their concern has been to the east towards India. So their definition of border, their concern would be more, of course, along the Kashmir and the Indian side. But Pakistan itself, its concern hasn't been much to the west. And there's their anti-terrorist capacity that they've been assisting U.S. has increased the importance of it. But still, to them, I think it's a difficult problem for them to deal with. And at the same time, when FCR is in place, it gives them free reign. If something does rise up, you can go in there and stomp that as best you can, and then retreat and let them live their lives as they do. But just know that you bring the hammer down on them if need be.
So I want to bring up, being in the humanities, I want to bring up a more cultural aspect to this whole border question. You guys deal with states, with localities, with current events, with defined borders and so forth. In my work, which is about imagined geographies, I'm very interested in how sort of center, border, center, periphery questions deal or reflect on defining identity, right? And I'm finding in my work that Russia is has a very harmed, sort of bad, unhealthy national identity at this point. Can we even talk about a Russian national identity? And so what I'm finding is I read novels like Alexander Plekhanov, who probably nobody's ever heard of. There's this incredibly popular novel, Господин Hexagen, Mr. Hexagen, which is a form of explosive, right, hexagen, that came out a number of years ago, and it revolves around security forces, the KGB, or successor to KGB, FSB, wanting to take over the government again, and it's an allegory for the rise of Putin to power. And what these people are doing is also using the border regions to make the Caucasus a failed region, to sow discord. And of course, they're talking mostly not about the states you're talking about, but about Chechnya, Dagestan, and so forth, so North Caucasus. And so I'm wondering, I guess my question would be, I find this a very deep irony, that security forces are sowing insecurity. Are there any cultural aspects, cultural texts, works of literature, art, whatever, that are relevant for how people think? Now, you're dealing with probably pretty illiterate people, right? But maybe there's some art that is very important to creating a sense of order, creating security, and so forth. Does that make sense for a question? Are there artifacts, cultural artifacts, whether written or visual or whatever, that help create or define security?
Okay, I'll start with the case of South Caucasus. And actually, your topic, imagined geography, would really you can get a lot of good case studies there, especially in Georgia, because Georgia actually, even though it's located in Caucasus, it doesn't feel that it's part of Middle East or part of even Eurasia. So basically, what we see the last maybe like 10, 12 years, that Georgia is struggling to find its identity, and basically so far it was trying to somehow label itself near to Ukraine with Black Sea identity. So that's a kind of struggle. But in reality, we have whatever we have. We're in the Caucasus. So And that's a kind of, whatever you can call it, imagined geography or whatever, but that's a kind of, also what is interesting, that Georgia wants some kind of like escape from Russia. And that's a kind of trend last 20 years, which is, some people may call it mission impossible or whatever. And then also, they also want to escape from the region. I mean, they don't want to wait until Azeris and Armenians just, finish this discussion about over Nagorno-Karabakh. They just want to be somehow involved in this Euro-Atlantic integration and to be part of the, nobody knows when, but maybe within long run, like 20 years or something, to be part of European Union. So, and that's a kind of, there's a lot of different interests between each country. And as far as North Caucasus, it's even more contentious, because if we speak about the sovereignty of the countries, and this is a theoretical aspect actually, which is more important, like humanitarian or sovereignty or whatever. I mean, different people, they have different definition of this. But for instance, we have a problem here that which is actually created after the war, because if we, for instance, legitimize the sovereignty of the small places like South Ossetia, where they have like 30,000 people, so then we have a problem like in other regions everywhere, for instance, like then what should we tell, for instance, Kurds, who actually also live in Srikart, and they are like almost like 40 million people. So I mean, there is a logic there. And then even worse, I mean, you cannot so-called like liberate people in Georgia, and you have the same problem in Northern Caucasus. So then either if you play that game, you have to play according to the rules. Or the rules should be either according to international law or according to new rules, which is so far unwritten. So, and then this situation even makes even more difficult in the Caucasus, because, for instance, just case of Dagestan. Can you imagine? I mean, at least I'm not an expert in the Dagestan issue, but at least I heard that they have almost like 40 languages. So can you imagine, for instance, that if Dagestan becomes whatever, independent or something, what language they have to speak? I mean, almost every village has its own. So there's a lot of issues actually related to this topic.
You had mentioned that the population I was looking at was probably fairly illiterate, which is true. But that being said, you've given me something else to look at here, because this is not where I've put a lot of my focus. But you don't have to be literate to have songs, poems, art, And I have to admit that has not been my focus. But I could see how. But I will give an example of how a tradition or something like that, and I've spoken of it, does have an impact on security without having to have any be illiterate. Is the Pashtun Code is an oral tradition, and it establishes they don't care about borders per se, but what they do is they care about tribal territory. And if someone from the other tribe comes over and does something to them in their territory, then they sure can use a blood feud or retribution to get back at that. And so, while it's not a picture, while it's not a poem, there's an oral tradition that is just understood. It is what it is to be Pashtun, is to have that in just innate in them. And so, but there's some other things to look at though on the other side that I mentioned.
So I'll go ahead and take one last question because we're almost out of time.
Cool, so my voice is kind of weird. I have a question for Shannon. I was interested in what you said about Armenian national identity having to do with this victimization mentality and having had land taken away from them. So do you think that's why they're pushing to get this law passed to get recognized as genocide? And also, if that's the case, what do you think the chances are for them to ever drop this? Because it actually harms their own interests in life.
That's a really good question. But what do they get if people recognize genocide? What's the payoff, right? And this is actually a big question in genocide studies. Why are different groups so passionate about having things recognized as genocide? And for example, most people would recognize Darfur, that's genocide. We've been told that's a genocide for these reasons. But if you look at that as a genocide, there's probably 14 other cases on the African continent that would also qualify as a genocide. So why should we recognize all of them as genocide? in the UN statement on genocide, it's actually very simple. And one of the things it says is that if you recognize a genocide, you have to do something about it. And that's why states are so reluctant. You can call it mass human atrocities, you can call it anything you want, but if you use the G word, you are then obligated to do something. So what does that mean for a historic genocide that's almost 100 years past? We don't know. Does that mean there's going to have to be retributions made or territory trading hands? But that's the thing. If you call it a genocide, you're supposed to do something about it. And so that is so key to the Armenian identity. This is one of the things they've really built up that holds them together. So yeah, what if it was recognized? Well, do they get Eastern Anatolia back? You know, that's an important question. I don't have the answer. I teach a whole class on it. I still don't have the answer. But thank you for the question.
Okay, I guess that wraps up our morning session. We now are having lunch in the curry room.